and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm Mike Leager. The 1980s might not seem like a decade conducive to the emergence of a groundbreaking gay theater. However, amidst the AIDS pandemic and a homophobic backlash to the gains of the post-Stonewall era, Charles Busch and Kenneth Elliott created something unique in New York City. The company that they founded, Theatre-in-Limbo, developed some of the biggest underground hits of the 80s, with unforgettable titles like Vampire Lesbians of Sodom and Psycho Beach Party. Now Kenneth Elliott is out with a new book, Beyond Ridiculous, Making Gay Theater with Charles Busch in 1980s New York, published by University of Iowa Press. It tells the story of Theatre-in-Limbo and makes a case for its underappreciated importance. Today we're fortunate to be joined by Dr. Elliott, who's chair of visual, media, and performing arts at Rutgers University. Ken, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
So it's in the very title of the book, the mention of ridiculous theater. Can we maybe pull back for a moment to establish some context and maybe tell listeners what was the theater of the ridiculous and perhaps specifically who was Charles Ludlam?
Right. Well, Charles Ludlam is the figure that's most identified nowadays in most histories of ridiculous theater because he really brought it to the attention of mainstream critics in New York City and had a successful company that operated for some, 20 years in the West Village. But it really started several years before Ludlam broke off and began his own company. With some folks who were peripherally involved with the pop art movement, such as Jack Smith, a filmmaker who's most known nowadays for his film Flaming Creatures. And Ludlam himself said that Smith is the daddy of us all. It kind of emerged from his aesthetic, and his aesthetic was based in rage against the dominant culture of the time. And you must remember in the late 50s and early 1960s, which were formative years for Smith's aesthetic, there were incredibly intolerant laws that against gay people. Bars were raided, people were routinely dismissed from jobs and blackmailed. It was a difficult time. And then, of course, the pretensions, as we all know now, it's easy to laugh at Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best and shows like that depicted a kind of idyllic post-war family unit as the be-all and end-all. But there were plenty of people who didn't go along with that scenario, and Jack Smith was certainly one of them. So the impetus behind this was to expose, I think, the dominant culture for the hypocrisy that was there. And it was that kind of space between reality and what was presented as reality that Jack Smith tried to expose in ridiculous theater, or the beginnings of ridiculous theater, I should say, in his film Flaming Creatures. And part of that was gender fluidity. In Flaming Creatures, men played women, but they weren't exactly women. As the title implies, they were flaming creatures. And in one of the more famous segments of the film, there were men who were wearing wigs and makeup, but you could also see their genitalia. The film was very shocking. It was very shocking at the time. And in fact, it was banned in New York State and many other places, and even involved a congressional inquiry. And if you can imagine senators and congresspeople in a meeting room at the Capitol viewing this film, which they regarded as pornography, I would love to have been in the room. I'd love to have been a fly on the wall for that. But anyhow, so ridiculous theater, then when it finally hit the stage with John Vaccaro directing and Ron Tavel, who was the scenarist for Andy Warhol's films at the time. So this came out of Andy Warhol's studio. The films that were initially made and then later turned into stage productions capitalized on the aesthetic that Jack Smith kind of began. And the earmarks of this were outrageous camp, a drag performance, parody of popular culture, as well as high culture, mixing it all together in kind of a postmodern stew, and presenting it as just outrageous fun. And it was layer upon layer of outrageousness that really marked ridiculous theater. Unlike, it's often confused with the Jean-Paul Sartre theater of the absurd, Beckett, that kind of thing. And it couldn't be more different from theater of the absurd. Theater of the ridiculous is outrageous, and outrageous in almost every way. And it was then Ludlum who took it several steps further. Initially, there was an anarchic quality to ridiculous theater. It essentially was plotless, outrageous fun. It could be like a series of skits, or what Ludlum referred to as epic theater, in as much as it just went on, and it didn't really matter what the plot was. But eventually Ludlum, with his company, turned to parodying forms such as the well-made play, and that made it more accessible to larger audiences. So Ludlum, starting with his production of Bluebeard, and then continuing with Camille, his adaptation of the classic well-made play, it started getting, the term he used was gaining converts. He wanted people to become converted to this idea, this aesthetic that was very campy. So anyhow, Ludlum's company became almost critics' darlings for a while of the New York Times. It was Mel Gussow who originally gave Bluebeard a rave review when it was being performed on top of a bar in Greenwich Village. It was at a gay bar. And if you can imagine, once again, the august critic of the New York Times going to a gay bar on Christopher Street called Christopher's End and seeing this production of Bluebeard and then giving it a rave review in the New York Times. But that really changed things for Ludlum. And he started getting big grants, and his theater in Sheridan Square, which he, I guess he was able to acquire that theater a few years after Bluebeard, became sort of a center of the gay community in the West Village. It was right in Sheridan Square. And it was certainly, I saw a number of his shows there. They were unforgettable, and he was absolutely hilarious as a performer. So anyway, that's sort of a rambling take on what ridiculous theater is, but it because it's morphed over the years, it's hard to say exactly what it is. You know, it's like it's different things for different people, but there's certain common basis for it, and that is camp, drag performance, outrageousness, and parody of popular and high culture.
Yeah, you're right about this kind of development of what you refer to as a gay aesthetic. And like you just said, there's sort of all this, the importance of camp, for instance. I guess, would you mind maybe expanding just a little bit more on what defines that? So what makes it so different, so special from maybe what came before or after?
Right. Well, so by a gay aesthetic, I guess largely I'm speaking about camp, and camp is a contested term, as I'm sure you're aware. It means different things to different people, and I don't pretend to have the ultimate definition of it. I'll tell you what it was for us was an appreciation of the outrageousness of 1930s and 40s films, and even 50s films. Just the wonderful intensity of those stars like Joan Crawford and Bette Davis. You know, who talks that way? You know, like it was the grandeur of Joan Crawford or of Katharine Hepburn. You know, this was outrageous fun to parody, easy to parody. And as has been pointed out, it's hard with today's movie stars. You know, like there's not so much to parody, but there was a pretension of those great stars to grandeur that was easy to puncture. You know, it's like, and it was fun to puncture it. So that's where we were coming from. But the term camp, as I'm sure you're probably aware, was first really defined, I guess, by an intellectual when Susan Sontag wrote her important essay in 1964, Notes on Camp. And she defined a camp as a way of looking at things that could be anything from Bette Davis to a Tiffany lamp. But what she, of course, left out of the whole equation was the fact that this is an aesthetic, a sense of humor, a way of looking at things that developed in the gay subculture. And it really has all of its roots are in the gay subculture. So even though it's been appropriated since then in many ways by straight filmmakers and theater artists, people like Mel Brooks does campy things in his films, right? But that really the beginning of that sense of humor came from the gay community. As far back, if you read the wonderful book Gay New York, as far back as the early part of the 20th century. And it also had to do with gender fluidity as well, like calling each other Mary and that kind of thing. That's a typical, old-fashioned way of camping. If you look at a character also, like, for example, the character Emery in Boys in the Band is another example of he's a high camp kind of character, because he's always referring to other men with female pronouns and that kind of thing. This was long before there was any dispute about pronouns or people were concerned about pronouns.
Now, at the center of the story of Theatre-in-Limbo is this relationship between you and Charles Busch. And I wonder if you could maybe start us off by just telling us, who is Charles Busch? How did the two of you meet? How did this whole kind of creative artistic partnership start?
Sure. Well, Charles is a playwright and performer. He's become kind of an iconic figure in New York theater over the years. But so when we first met, we were both students at Northwestern. We were both in a production of Romeo and Juliet, and we got to know each other because we had such small parts in this production in the green room at Kahn Auditorium at Northwestern. And we developed a friendship. I mean, we weren't the closest of friends at Northwestern, but we remained friends throughout our college experience. And then when I was moving to New York, and Charles has lived in New York with his aunt in a lovely apartment on Park Avenue, and she was wanting to get him out of there because it was really just a one-bedroom apartment, and he'd been staying there for quite a long time. And she was like, "It's time for you to get your own place." So when I came to town, I gave Charles a call. I was calling everybody I knew, which is what one does when moving to New York City. And when I went over to visit Charles, his aunt really was sort of persistently suggesting that maybe we could get an apartment together. We could be roommates. And so we ended up doing that. So we were roommates for a number of years in this tenement apartment that Charles found for us in the Village. It was, when I say tenement, people think, oh, it was like a slummy sort of atmosphere. No, not really. It was on a great block in the West Village on 12th Street between Greenwich Avenue and West 4th Street. And I mean, you couldn't have a nicer block, really. But these buildings were tenement buildings in as much as they were railroad flats. That's more of an architectural term than a pejorative term. But it was a floor-through apartment. So there was no privacy. You come in through the kitchen, you walk through my bedroom, then Charles's bedroom, and then the living room. The rooms were all lined up like railroad cars. Anyhow, Charles and I were separately pursuing careers for a couple of years when we lived together. I was starting out as a stage manager, and Charles was trying to get his solo show on at the time. He realized that he was a difficult type to cast. He was very slender, somewhat effeminate. It was hard for him to get parts. So he wrote solo shows for himself, and where he played all the parts. And these were great shows. Charles did a superb job with these scripts, and he performed them wonderfully. And he got kind of a little bit of a cult following, performing at places like the Duplex on Grove Street in the Village. And Ludlum noticed Charles. Charles invited Ludlum to come and see his performance, and Ludlum became sort of an enthusiastic supporter. Anyhow, that was fine, but it wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't leading to anything. And something that's often neglected in theater histories is that theater people need to eat, and they need to have an apartment. And unless you are on Broadway or in a long-running show off Broadway or affiliated with some major arts institution, it's kind of hard to piece together a freelance existence. So we were getting a little desperate, to be quite honest. And my father was pushing me to go to law school, and Charles was despondent because he had put together this wonderful one-man show that I ended up directing, and nothing was happening with it. So as a sort of a last fling before I was going to start to go to law school, he said, let's go to the East Village and see our friend Bina Sharif, who's putting on a show at the Limbo Lounge. And we schlepped over there in a taxi because it was a very dangerous neighborhood at the time. But we were really taken with this wonderful atmosphere in this club, this storefront club in the East Village. And after the show, we approached the owner of the club and asked if we could do a show there. And he said, sure. And he put us on the calendar. And that was all it took to get a show on in the East Village in 1984. So Charles had a script in his trunk. It was Vampire Lesbians of Sodom. And we quickly assembled a cast. And that's how we got started with our company. It was very, very ad hoc. That's for sure.
Yeah, I'm particular. I mean, it's such a striking title, and you write about how that kind of got a lot of attention for Theatre-in-Limbo in the early days. I'm curious about the origins and just the nature of Vampire Lesbians of Sodom as a play.
Yeah, so Charles was writing plays and he took a playwriting class at Northwestern, and I remember reading an early draft of the play that became Vampire Lesbians. It was called Teeth Marks at the time, and I vaguely remember giving him my thoughts about it, and then I never heard about it again. And he kind of pulled it out and rewrote it for himself in drag. And this was the thing. It's like, at the time, we were wanting to have real careers in the theater, and Charles had avoided doing drag because there's a stigma to that, and there was much more of a stigma to it in the early 1980s and 1984 than there is now with RuPaul and all that. It's kind of like a whole thing that is accepted, at least in many circles. But it wasn't the case then. It was a very marginal thing to do. So that's why he developed the one-man show, so that he could play the parts, and he could play women and men without putting on a wig or a dress. He always had a very severe black costume. But for Vampire Lesbians, he wanted to just have fun and to put on a dress and to put on a wig and to do the whole thing and be as outrageous as could be, because why? We thought that no one would ever see it. It would never go anywhere. And we were just doing it in this hole-in-the-wall club in the East Village. And that would be that. It would be like a party for our friends, which is what a lot of East Village performance was like at the time. It was a party-like atmosphere. So we just simply called friends that we knew and said, would you be interested in being in a show for 2 nights at the Limbo Lounge? And some friends turned us down, that they weren't interested, but we were able to assemble a group. And the title itself that you were asking about, I mean, there's a little bit of, I don't know who came up with that title. It was either Charles or his friend Ed Tausig. I think Ed may have been the person who came up with the exact title. And the whole point of the title was to be as outrageous as possible. And so it was to shock. And so when we had flyers that had the title, Charles created the flyers himself. He's a very talented artist as well. He worked for a while as a portrait artist. So yeah, when we sent these flyers out and we put them up around the East Village, it was shocking, and that helped to draw a crowd. People wanted something like that was very in your face, just obviously anti-establishment. The title itself is about as outrageous as the show gets. Because the show itself is not really, it delivers in as much as it's lots of fun. But you would think from a title like that it would be maybe more outrageous than it was. But it was just a fun romp for us to perform for friends, more or less. And and gave Charles the opportunity to put on a wig and a dress and enjoy himself in front of an audience, which he certainly did.
Yeah, there's this whole. I thought it was really interesting in your book. You describe this kind of dynamic where particularly Charles Busch is playing multiple roles, but kind of in a sense of like there's this sort of central leading lady character who in turn almost gets cast in the various early productions that Theatre-in-Limbo does, I believe. your next major production was, I believe it was called Theodora, She Bitch of Byzantium.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like there's a central character that he's playing, and then on top of that, there's whatever specific character is in the plays. I thought that was a really kind of interesting dynamic, and I wondered if you could maybe talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, well, that developed over time. Initially, in Vampire Lesbians, I mean, Charles had a long fascination with Sarah Bernhardt and the great movie stars of the 30s and 40s, among others. So there were elements of all of that in his performance. But as we did additional shows, we I should say, because it really was Charles, developed this persona of the star of the show. And the star of the show had the qualities of many recognizable stars, so that you would see a glimpse of Norma Shearer, or a bit of Betty Davis, or a bit of Joan Crawford. A little bit of Barbara Stanwyck would come out from time to time. And you see these different stars had very different approaches. And Barbara Stanwyck, was a tough dame, and sometimes that was appropriate. So suddenly he'd be Barbara Stanwyck, and the next minute he would be elegant Norma Shearer. But it all kind of, at first it was a little bit rough around the edges, the transition from one quotation to another, but gradually it sort of smoothed out and became this persona of the star of the show. And really the concept of, as we did more shows and we moved to the larger Limbo Lounge the next fall, because this was the time, we'll get to this in a minute, I think, but the East Village was really rapidly changing and gentrifying at the time, and we thought we could, capitalize on that. And so as a company, we decided that it would be fun to have sort of the idea of a second or third rate touring troupe with an actor manager, like, then Charles was the actor manager, the star of the show, and there were players who would always play the same type of role, the leading man, the ingenue, that kind of the character man, the walking gentleman, that sort of thing. And so each actor in the company had his own persona that we tried to capitalize on each time. And always at the center of it was the star who sort of held the whole company together.
Yeah, you were just talking about how, in a number of ways, the environment around you is changing. The East Village is changing. Not long after Theatre-in-Limbo gets started, the Limbo Lounge itself moves to a new venue. I'm just kind of curious. I mean, what was it like playing the new venue, but also how were things changing around you as this theater troupe kind of gets started?
I think I mentioned earlier that we were nervous when we first went to the Limbo Lounge the very first time to see our friend Bina Sharif perform, because it was in Alphabet City, those avenues A, B, and C that are east of First Avenue, and that area of town had a reputation at the time of being very dangerous. It was a marginal neighborhood, and we were a little scared. I mean, it's nervous making to go there. It was block after block of buildings that had been torched by landlords to get insurance money. Some blocks had hardly any residents in them at all. There was a lot of drug dealing that was going on, lots of homeless people. Remember, this was in the early 1980s, and there was a real homeless problem in New York at the time. There still is, but I mean, it was first becoming evident at the time. And it was just menacing to go into that area. And yet part of the reason that the area could start gentrifying and changing was because young people realized, well, it might be scary, but the rents are cheap. And we could go over there and, we could rent a storefront for a song and have an art gallery or a performance space. And that's what started the whole gentrification of that area. And soon there were restaurants like the Life Cafe, but then many others that opened up nearby, and it became a scene. And when it was finally noticed by New York Magazine and other mainstream periodicals that, gee, this area of town, this is where the young people are going. This is where the interesting clubs and art galleries, this is where Keith Haring and Basquiat are showing their work. It became a destination, and you would see limousines parked out in front of a bombed out building on a desolate street, but you knew that, things were changing. And so the owners of the Limbo, what was called the Limbo Lounge when it was on 10th Street, just opposite Tompkins Square Park, they sold their lease on that building. And with the money that they got from selling the lease, they were able to lease an old sanitation garage that was another block further east. And it was a much larger space. And they took the money that they made from selling their lease and they converted it into a performance space / gallery. And it was a fun and an illegal bar because all the bars were unlicensed at the time. So but that was part of the fun. People broke the law, and it was like, didn't matter because it was the East Village. Yeah. So the neighborhood was rapidly changing. So the folks who ran the Limbo Lounge became more upscale with their new space, but then time caught up with them eventually, and it got out of control, right? I mean, so now you go to the East Village in this area, this block of the East Village, it was the 600 block of East 9th Street is where the new Limbo Lounge, which they decided to eliminate the word lounge, and they just call it the Limbo. And where that building was, you walk down there, it's all lovely apartments and really nice. At the time, it was graffiti everywhere, desolate, kind of crummy apartment houses. It really was not pretty. Let me put it that way. But that was part of what it was, the atmosphere of the whole thing. So you felt like you were going somewhere. It was, in some articles, they talked about it kind of like the Weimar Republic, going to these, like the Kit Kat Club, that kind of thing. But I think if you really were trying to find an analogy for that period, it would really be more like Dresden after the Allied bombing. And in fact, there was one street, it's 8th Street between B and C, where the club 8BC was, which was a famous performance space, that they was referred to sometimes as Little Dresden. So yeah, I mean, it was you really wouldn't have thought walking over there that anything could ever happen to that neighborhood to transform it. But it has, you see. So all of Manhattan now is forbidden in terms of rents, because no young person could move to Manhattan today unless you had a trust fund. But it wasn't the case back then.
As for the people involved in Theatre-in-Limbo, as you're talking about, you're building a company here as well. And I'm just curious about who are some of the early members of the theater company beyond you and Charles Busch.
Right. So Charles wrote an excellent part for a co-star in Vampire Lesbians, and our very first co-star was Obie Award-winning actress from the Charles Ludlam's company, but she didn't want to stay with the show because it was Lola Pashalinski, and she did 2 performances our first weekend, and then announced that she'd had enough. And Charles and I both sort of speculated that she played on the bar top at Christopher's End on Christopher Street with Ludlam, and she'd had enough of that kind of performance, and she was doing it as a lark for one weekend. So then we were kind of up a tree, like, who are we going to get to play this part? And we found a friend of ours, Julie Halston, who was at the time a Wall Street librarian, but she had been a theater major at Hofstra. And we brought her in. I was a little dubious at first of whether that would work out because she didn't have that much acting experience, but she really developed a unique kind of style, and it ultimately clicked. It took a while. It took a while for her to get kind of adjusted to the rhythms of our company, but she finally really took off. And then Charles ended up writing multiple parts for her where she really, and I would say this only between us because Charles would be very irritated, but she stole the show a number of times. She was superb, and Charles didn't care for that, but he did very generously write great parts for her. And we had other, a friend of Charles's, Arnie Kolodner, a magician that he knew from the Renaissance Fair, was a handsome young guy. He became our leading man. Someone that I met at a gay bar on Christopher Street, Bobby Carey, who had no acting experience whatsoever, became our beefcake, more or less. I mean, he was always taking his clothes off in show after show because he had a spectacular body. And Charles's best friend, Andy Halliday, I should mention him. Charles always wrote wonderful parts for Andy, who was a wiry, eccentric guy who could play all kinds of wonderful character parts. So yeah, so it was all friends who got together. We had other friends from Northwestern, like Tom Molino, who was part of the original company, and he was a character actor and wonderfully funny. He just had a great comic sense. So yeah, it was all by happenstance. They were just friends that we pulled together more or less for the party. We wanted to have fun, and I think when you're having fun on stage, that's communicated to the audience, and they can have fun too.
Yeah, I was wondering about the audience because it really seems like you build up a following, a pretty impressive one. Who's coming to see these shows, and many of whom seem to be repeat customers, if you will.
Initially, it was our friends who came, but I think word of mouth spread, and as we continued to schedule performances of Vampire Lesbians and then Theodora, She Bitch of Byzantium, it was really word of mouth. But we did collect names and addresses of audience members. We had a book at the back of the house, and people signed in, so that we developed a pretty extensive mailing list, so that every time we opened a show, we went to our mailing list, and it was a pretty reliable way to generate an audience. And yeah, you're right. I mean, we had a lot of people who came over and over again. It was a unique experience going to the East Village at that time. As I said, the atmosphere was a little dicey, but there was a real sense of community in the room when you were at one of our shows, and there was a give and take with the audience that was just an extraordinary experience. That's unlike anything that I've experienced since.
So, Vampire Lesbians of Sodom turns into a pretty fair-sized hit, and eventually becomes big enough that you move it to the Provincetown Playhouse. What happens when you kind of take that next step?
That's always a tricky thing, because and a lot of people said you'd be crazy to move this. It belongs in the Limbo Lounge. It belongs in the East Village. We did it for a shoestring. The costumes were thrown together. Charles just had a bunch of garments in his closet that we managed to turn into extravagant costumes one way or another. So moving it was a tricky exercise. I think it most definitely at the time was almost dangerous to do so, because we risked losing our special audience. I mean, our audience was primarily gay. So when you move to a commercial production, you have to expand your audience. And we were able to do that, but it didn't always work out. We had experiences at the Provincetown Playhouse. And I should say, just for those who may not be familiar with the Provincetown Playhouse, it was an historic theater on McDougal Street. It had been started by the Provincetown Players back in the teens, the 1918, in that range, by Eugene O'Neill and his friends that had worked together up in Provincetown, and that's why they called it the Provincetown Playhouse. They needed a winter home in Manhattan, and it was a small commercial house at the time we took our show there. There were 175 seats, so it was difficult to book, because it was really too small for producers to make an enormous amount of money there. But nevertheless, it had a storied history and was very well regarded theater. So when we moved there, gosh, I mean, I feel like I heard so many naysayers that you just can't do it. But there was one man who encouraged me, and his name was Arthur Cantor. He was a Broadway producer at the time, and he was the general manager of the Provincetown Playhouse. And he felt the show had promise, and he wanted a booking for his theater that he thought would run. And he pushed me to produce it myself. I was hoping he'd produce it, because I didn't want to deal with, I'd never raised the kind of money that you needed to do an off-Broadway show. But somehow or other, by hook or by crook, we managed to raise, the capitalization was only $55,000. And that sounds like nothing nowadays. But at the time, it might have been $500,000 or $1 million. It's, as far as we were concerned, raising $55,000 seemed insurmountable. But somehow we managed to do it. And it took a while. We had to go back to the Limbo Lounge repeatedly to do the show again and bring potential investors down. And we were able to move, and we just got lucky. I mean, we really, because luck plays such an important part in theater. It really is extraordinary. You know, that when we moved to the Provincetown Playhouse, we had really great audiences. We had $15 preview performances and great audiences, and we were thrilled with the way it was going. And then one Sunday afternoon, we did the show. You have to do 8 a week, right? It's not like doing just weekend performances for a party anymore. It's like you have to grind out 8 performances a week. And this Sunday matinee, we were suddenly stunned at the silence. Like things that had always gotten a laugh didn't get it anymore. And like, what's the problem here? And we were a little mortified. We thought we're done for, you know. But then that evening, the Sunday evening performance, the audience was great again. So it really was mysterious. And luckily, the critic for the New York Times was a gay man, D.J.R. Bruckner, who loved it and gave it a rave review. But we got some terrible reviews too. And that afternoon, that was the quietest audience ever. That afternoon, John Simon, the critic from the New York Magazine, was in attendance. He left at the intermission and he loathed it with a passion. So if he had been the critic for the New York Times, we never would have gone anywhere, right? But because the critic from the Times was predisposed to like it and raved about it, we became a hit. And then the trick of it really was, for sustaining this production, it was being able to play to a range of audiences, because, you know, our initial gay audience kind of dissipated after a time, and then we were having tourists largely for years. I kind of said it was the show that people come to New York and see something kind of naughty and go, so that they can go back to Oshkosh or wherever they're from and say, well, we saw Vampire Lesbians of Sodom. I mean, it was kind of that sort of thing in a sense. And but it worked for whatever reason. And part of it was that I was able to keep, I was the producer and ultimately the general manager of the show, as well as the director and being in it for 10 months. But I was able to keep the costs down. And that's how it was able to run, because sometimes we had very small audiences, but then boom, on Saturday night, we'd fill the place, and that would sustain us for a week.
Well, I have to say, I'm not from Oshkosh specifically, but I am from Wisconsin, so I guess I understand that dynamic.
And there's nothing against Oshkosh. I've never been there, so it's like, I'm sure it's wonderful. But that's the way I always thought of it, is like people from the Midwest, and I'm from the Midwest too. I'm from Indiana, so it's, you know, it's nothing against the Midwest, but you felt like tourists coming to see something a little naughty, you know, and that's with the title and the drag performance, you know, that filled the bill. And also it was silly fun, and and audiences loved that.
Yeah, and it sounds like from your book, it sounds like that's kind of part of what sustained the show's success. And you sought to build off of that. I know Theatre-in-Limbo goes on to develop a number of other works. Probably the title that listeners might be most familiar with is Psycho Beach Party. But I understand there were a number of other works that you develop after Vampire Lesbians.
Well, yeah, Psycho Beach Party is maybe somewhat well known because it became a movie as well. And I really, the thing that I point out in the book is just the irony that Jack Smith's Flaming Creatures was banned in New York and many other states, and, you know, was a cause celeb of intellectuals. I mean, the aforementioned Susan Sontag wrote an essay about Flaming Creatures as well. But then Psycho Beach Party opened in multiplexes across the country, and there were no incidents at all. So that's how times change, right? So our next, well, we got a little bored, I have to say. You know, anybody who's done 8 a week for an extended period of time may find that it gets a little tedious repeating the same thing over and over again. So we ended up going back to the Limbo Lounge several times to do late shows after our curtain came down at the Provincetown Playhouse. I would rent a van, and we'd all go over to the Limbo and do a new show. And Psycho Beach Party really started out as a play called Gidget Goes Psychotic, and that once again, one of those titles that just sells. And Limbo Lounge was packed once again, and audiences laughing. And I thought, gee, maybe I should try this again. So we moved that one to another theater. It was also on McDougal Street, the Players Theater. And it ran for over a year, but was not, or maybe it wasn't quite a year. Maybe it was more like 10 months. I'm forgetting the length of the run exactly. It ran for a while, but it didn't have the success that Vampire Lesbians had. And partly that was due to once again, the critics. I mean, the Times critic, Stephen Holden, who reviewed that, liked it, but it wasn't a rave. So, I mean, things like that made a big difference, I think. I think also the fact that Charles was playing a girl who has a boyfriend by the end of the show that she's going off with might have been unsettling to some of the straight people in the audience, whereas in Vampire Lesbians of Sodom, it's all a joke. But there was a slightly maybe unsettling romantic relationship between Charles and Arnie in Psycho Beach Party, at least to some people. That's one theory as to why it didn't pan out as strongly as Vampire Lesbians, even though it had a respectable run. Yeah. So then there were others. We did a show called, we developed a relationship with Kyle Rennick at the WPA Theater, and we did The Lady in Question there, which was a parody of 1940s anti-Nazi melodramas. And then we did a parody of 1950s anti-communist films called Red Scare and Sunset that was also rather disturbing to a lot of people, because a lot of people from that era were still alive and did not find the parody amusing. It was just more troubling to them because that period was so hideous, the 1950s, for anyone who had been blacklisted or accused of being a communist. So it's like we certainly had a little bit of backlash even to that, even though, once again, it had a respectable run and did reasonably well.
As you're talking about the works that Theatre-in-Limbo develop, when you write the book, you're really, you're mostly stepping out of the way. You're kind of putting on your historian hat. But you're also developing at this time as a director, in addition to sometimes appearing on stage in Theatre-in-Limbo productions. You're sort of developing your own career. I'm wondering if you would just be willing to share a little bit about the role that you specifically played in Theatre-in-Limbo, how that maybe connects to what you find yourself doing as the company gains prominence and success.
Once again, it developed in a very ad hoc way. I mean, it started out, I wanted to be a director. I mean, that was starting out as a stage manager when I came out of Northwestern was I thought considered a stepping stone to being a director. It's really not that simple, but that was sort of the idea. And so by directing Charles's one-man show at first, and then directing these shows at the Limbo Lounge, I thought, oh, this is my pathway into being a director. I got saddled with producing the show because no one else wanted to produce it, and so that's how I became a producer. And then I became the general manager of the production because the general manager that I had hired made a terrible error in the payment scale of actors' equity and overpaid our actors, that he almost bankrupted the production, and we had to let him go. So I ended up becoming the general manager of the show as well. So I was kind of wearing an awful lot of hats, and I still occasionally appeared in shows as well. So the directing, producing, general managing, but it all happened sort of by accident. But you learn along the way how things work, right? So yeah, it was a great experience. I mean, because there's nothing like really exploring all the areas of theater and wearing all those hats that gives you an idea of what it takes to put on a show. It was a great experience. I wouldn't have changed it for anything, even though at the time I wanted someone else to be the producer. Like, I just wanted to be paid, right?
Now you're producing these works, these delightfully campy, ridiculous plays, at the same time that the AIDS crisis continues to grow. If you're willing to talk about it, what was it like to be making art at that time? how did it relate perhaps to what you and your friends, your colleagues were doing? And how did you maybe help you get through that time, that moment?
Well, it was horrible. I mean, there's really no other way of describing the horrific, this, the plague of AIDS at the time was, I mean, and it was everywhere. And we knew an awful lot of people who developed AIDS and died, including several in our company along the way. So that was a backdrop to what we were doing at the time. And partly, you know, Charles wanted to escape. There was a sense of, how do we get out of this horrible world that we live in? We can do it through make believe, by taking us to ancient Byzantium or the 1940s or the 1950s, and putting on a show and living in that world. And so there was definitely a sense of like, this is our escape valve from the horror of everyday life in New York in the 1980s. And I think a lot of our fans, a lot of the people who came to our shows were looking for that too. They wanted to escape the world that they lived in, and they could do so by coming to the Limbo Lounge or coming to one of our shows at the WPA Theater, for example. But I think there was also in the audience and in relation to the performers themselves, a sense of community that helped to ameliorate the awfulness of the AIDS crisis at the time. It was coming together, and I think and that's also what theater is, right? I mean, it's an audience coming together in the same room with performers, but there was a particular audience, and it was the gay community so affected by this AIDS crisis. And many of the people, it was just quite evident. I would watch people entering the theater and know that they had AIDS. I mean, you could see it in their faces, the drawn faces, sometimes with Kaposi's sarcoma. And you thought, oh my God, terrible. But they found joy in coming to the theater, and it was at least a temporary escape from that. And I think that's because the shows that we did really had nothing whatsoever to do with AIDS. And when I mentioned in the book that it was a gay aesthetic rather than a gay story, I mean, we really didn't have a lot of gay characters in the plays. I mean, so it wasn't about that. It wasn't about AIDS. It wasn't about contemporary issues. It wasn't about that. It was about, outrageous stories from the past that we were inflecting with a modern sensibility, But it definitely was the sense of community that tied us all together. I think that reflected the period that AIDS was destroying the city.
How does Theatre-in-Limbo ultimately dissolve?
It was kind of an organic thing. I mean, so we had several members of our company, our choreographer, Jeff Feasey, our leading lady who replaced Julie Halston for a period of time, Megan Robinson, who was wonderful, and Bobby Carey, whom I mentioned earlier, all died of AIDS while we were still performing. And so there was the loss of those members of the company, but also, as I mentioned before, Charles and I both needed to earn a living, and we needed to find new ways to get by in the theater. It's running this little company with shows that ran for a period of time off Broadway was just not paying for the rent in our New York apartments and to live the way we wanted to live. So we all just kind of moved on, and that's really the way it happened. I mentioned in the book that at Bobby Carey's memorial service, which we held at the Provincetown Playhouse, all the company was there, the surviving members, and yet that was kind of like almost not just a funeral or memorial service for Bobby, but really for the company itself, right? It was clearly kind of over by that time.
You write about Theatre-in-Limbo often getting, as you put it, quote, left out of overviews of gay, avant-garde, and off-Broadway theater of the period. Why is that exactly? And what do you think makes Theatre-in-Limbo so important? Why should it be part of that story?
First off, I think part of the reason that we maybe were left out of some of these overviews is that we transferred so many shows to commercial off-Broadway productions. I mean, and so they kind of get viewed as lightweight commercial comedies rather than serious works in the tradition of Charles Ludlam. I mean, I think that has a lot to do with it. And in point of fact, the plays themselves were intended to be fun and entertaining, and we gradually, as we gained experience, they became more polished and they had a kind of commercial quality to them, I guess. So I think that's part of it. But the fact that we started out in the East Village, and that I think our audience was most definitely a gay audience, and the aesthetic of our shows, the ridiculous aesthetic, the camp aesthetic, was an aesthetic that appealed most to gay audiences. I think that's why, we should be a part of that history, and I hope we are now. But because we were there, but it's hard to say. It's like Ludlam was the critic's darling. We were often compared to Ludlam's company, to the ridiculous theatrical company, and usually the comparisons were not favorable. Sometimes they were, but yeah, there was a sense that Ludlam was a serious artist and we were rather frivolous. I don't really think that's true. I think, regardless of the fact that the shows were well structured and entertaining and featured a lot of well executed comedy, I think there was more to them than simply a frolic. And the fact that our leading lady was a man at a time when that was not that accepted, it was transgressive in its own way. I think that largely, though, it was the idea that we were presenting what were viewed as commercial shows. Yeah, so if there were one thing that I would just like to leave us with, it's the idea that, even though this is partly a memoir of mine, but more than that, it is the history of a theater company and how it began and how it developed and ended in a very pivotal time in New York history, the 1980s, in the midst of the AIDS crisis, and when things were changing radically. And it's not just the East Village that's changing, although that was part of it, but it was the way the mainstream perceives gay people. That was changing radically at the time as well. So it was an interesting period. I wouldn't want to live through it again, but it was an unforgettable time.
We'll post links in our show notes that will let you learn more about Theatre-in-Limbo and the wider ridiculous theater movement. Ken, thank you so much for sharing your experiences and for talking to us about your book, Beyond Ridiculous.
My pleasure. It's been a delight.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit theaterhistorypodcast.net and follow @theaterhistory on social media. Please note that, while we usually spell theater Theatre, it ends in ER on our social media handle. Our theme music is The Black Crook Gallop, which comes to us courtesy of the New York Public Library Libretto Project and Adam Roberts. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.